Yeah? Okay.
I'm sorry, Shmuel. I'm sorry we didn't find any evidence. Shmuel nodded his head sadly. He wasn't really surprised. He hadn't really expected to. I think I ought to go home now. Will you walk back to the fence with me? Shmuel opened his mouth to answer, but at that moment there was a loud whistle, and 10 soldiers surrounded an area of the camp in which Bruno and Shmuel were standing. In The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne, the ever-curious Bruno goes exploring and discovers the shy, malnourished Shmuel, who is clothed in striped pajamas, on the other side of a fence. For over a year, the two boys visit with each other and become close friends. One day, Bruno crawls under the fence dressed like Shmuel, and the two boys go looking for Shmuel's father, who has gone missing. What happens next is beyond what either of them could have ever known. What's happening? What's going on?
It happens sometimes. They make people go on marches.
Marches? I can't go on a march. I have to be home in time for dinner. It's roast beef tonight.
Shh! Don't say anything or they get angry.
Bruno frowned, but was relieved that all the people in striped pajamas from this part of the camp were gathering together now, most of them being pushed together by the soldiers, so that he and Shmuel were hidden in the center of them and couldn't be seen. He didn't know what everyone looked so frightened about. After all, marching wasn't such a terrible thing, and he wanted to whisper to them that everything was all right, that Father was the commandant, and if this was the kind of thing he wanted the people to do, well, then it must be all right. The whistle blew again, and this time a group of people, which must have numbered about 100, started to march slowly together. There was some sort of disturbance towards the back where some people seemed unwilling to march, but Bruno was too small to see what happened, and all he could hear were some loud noises like the sounds of gunshots, but he couldn't make out what they were. Does the marching go on for long? Bruno was beginning to feel hungry now.
I never see the people after they've gone on the march, but I wouldn't imagine it does.
Bruno frowned. He looked up at the sky, and as he did, there was another loud sound, and this time it was the sound of thunder overhead. And just as quickly, the sky seemed to grow even darker, almost black, and rain began to pour down even more heavily than it had in the morning. Bruno closed his eyes for a moment and felt it wash over him. When he opened them again, he wasn't so much marching as being swept along with a group of people, and all he could feel was the mud that was caked all over his body, and his pajamas clinging to his skin with all the rain, and he longed to be back in his house, watching all this from a distance, and not wrapped up in the center of it. Ugh, that's it! I'm going to catch a cold out here! I have to go home! But just as Bruno said this, his feet took him up a set of steps, and as he continued marching, he found that the rain was no longer coming down because they were all piling into a long room that was surprisingly warm and must have been very securely built because there was no rain getting in from anywhere. In fact, it felt completely airtight. Ha! Well, that's something. I expect we'll have to wait here until the rain lets off, and then I'll get to go home. Shmuel gathered himself up very close to Bruno and looked up at him in fright. I'm sorry we didn't find your papa, Shmuel.
It's all right.
And I'm sorry we didn't really get to play, but when you come to Berlin, that's what we'll do. And I'll introduce you to... Oh, what were their names? They were supposed to be his 3 best friends for life, but they had all but vanished from his memory now. He couldn't remember any of their names, and he couldn't picture any of their faces. Actually, it doesn't really matter whether I do or don't. They're not my best friends anymore anyway. Bruno looked down and did something quite out of character for him. He reached out and took Shmuel's tiny hand in his and squeezed it tightly. You're my best friend, Shmuel. My best friend for life. Schmuel may well have opened his mouth to say something back, but Bruno never heard it because at that moment there was a loud gasp from all the marchers as the door at the front closed and a loud metallic sound rang through from the outside. Bruno raised an eyebrow, unable to make the sense of all this, but assumed it had something to do with keeping the rain out and stopping the people from catching colds. And then the room went dark, and despite the chaos that followed, Bruno found that he was still holding Schmuel's hand in his, and nothing in the world would have persuaded him to let go. Nothing more was ever heard of Bruno after that. Several days later, after the soldiers had searched every part of the house and gone into all the local towns and villages with pictures of the little boy, one of the soldiers found a pile of clothes and the pair of boots that Bruno had left near the fence. He left them there, undisturbed, and went to fetch the commandant, who examined the area and looked to his left and looked to his right, but for the life of him could not understand what had happened to his son. It was as if he had just vanished off the face of the earth and left his clothes behind him. Mother did not return to Berlin quite as quickly as she had hoped. She stayed at Outwood for several months, waiting for news of Bruno, when one day, quite suddenly, she thought he might have made his way home alone, and so she went back to their old house, half expecting to see him sitting there on the steps, waiting for her. He wasn't there, of course. Gretel went back to Berlin with Mother and spent a lot of time alone in her room crying, not because she had thrown out all her dolls and not because she left all her maps at Outwith, but because she missed Bruno so much. Father stayed at Outwith for another year and became very disliked by the other soldiers, whom he ordered around mercilessly. He went to sleep every night thinking of Bruno, and he woke up every morning thinking of him too. One day, he formed a theory as to what might have occurred and went back to the place in the fence where the pile of clothes had been found the year before. There was nothing particularly special about this place or different, but then he did a little exploration of his own and found that the fence here was not properly attached as it was everywhere else, and that when lifted created a gap large enough for a very small person, such as a little boy, to crawl underneath. He looked off in the distance and followed it through logically, step by step by step. And when he did, he found that his legs no longer seemed to work right, as if they could no longer hold up his body, and he found himself sitting in almost the exact same position as Bruno had every afternoon for a year. Several months after this, some soldiers came to Outwith, and Father was ordered to go with them. And he went without complaint, and he did so happily because he didn't really mind what they did to him anymore. And that's the end of the story of Bruno and his family. Of course, all this happened a long time ago, and nothing like this could ever happen again. Not in this day and age.